Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, January 17th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The Senate rejects a bill to probe the Gaza slaughter. So the Senate on Tuesday night voted down a resolution introduced by Senator Bernie Sanders that would have frozen U.S. military aid to Israel if the State Department failed to produce a report on whether Israel was committing human rights violations in Gaza. So this resolution invoked the 1961 Foreign Assistance Act, and aid would have also been frozen if human rights violations were found, and I think it's very clear that there would be many to find if there was a real investigation that happened. So the legislation failed pretty badly. It was voted down in a vote of 72 to 11, with only one Republican, which was Senator Rand Paul, voting in favor of it. So it received support from one Republican, 9 Democrats, and then Bernie Sanders, he votes with Democrats mainly, but he is a independent. So Sanders wrote on X before the vote, quote, "It should not be controversial to ask how U.S. weapons are used. We should all want this information. If you believe the war has been indiscriminate, as I do, then we must ask this question. If you believe Israel has done nothing wrong, then this information should support that belief," end quote. During a speech on the Senate floor last week, Sanders said that due to the, quote, "scale of the destruction and the extensive use of U.S. arms in this campaign, including thousands of massive 2,000-pound bombs, Congress must act to conduct real oversight," end quote. And many of the Republicans who are all about oversight for the aid to Ukraine, for the money going to Ukraine, for all the weapons being poured into that war, none of them, except for Rand Paul, came out in support of this. And what the U.S. is doing, how the U.S. is supporting Israel, it's much less transparent than what's going on in Ukraine. Now, there's no oversight once the weapons get to Ukraine, but the Pentagon releases these detailed lists of all the weapons that they're sending, and they're not doing that for Israel. We don't really know the extent of this, don't know how they're paying for all this. The U.S. gives Israel $3.8 billion each year in military aid, but they seem to be dipping into lots of other funds for this. That's not clear, but nobody seems to care. So this is really the first bill that was voted on that sought to kind of rein in what's happening here, that sought to kind of, conduct some oversight of the U.S. support for this mass slaughter of Palestinians. So the White House, of course, came out against the resolution ahead of the vote as it supports unconditional aid to Israel despite the massive civilian death toll. John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesman, he said, quote, "We do not believe that this resolution is the right vehicle to address these issues," end quote. And he doesn't think anything is the right vehicle. He does not want to address these issues. Kirby has shrugged off, the massive civilian death toll throughout the war. He's been kind of the main White House propagandist on this war, kind of the face of it. When they have the White House press conferences. All right, so the next one here, Qatar says that Israel and Hamas reached a deal on medicine and aid. So this article is from CNN. I just saw this not long before I started recording. And so we just threw this CNN article up here. But Qatar says that it has brokered a deal between Israel and Hamas that will see medicines delivered to Israeli hostages in Gaza in exchange for the delivery of medicine and humanitarian aid to Palestinian civilians. So the Qatari Foreign Ministry wrote on X, quote, "Medicine, along with other humanitarian aid, is to be delivered to civilians in the Gaza Strip, in the most affected and vulnerable areas, in exchange for delivering medication needed for Israeli captives in Gaza," end quote. The medications and aid will leave Doha on Wednesday and head to Egypt before being transported to Gaza, the ministry added. It is unclear when the medicines are expected to reach Gaza. So they say they're allowing aid into Gaza, but the fact that they need a deal to get medicine into the Gaza Strip shows that They're not letting much in. So relatives of the more than 100 remaining hostages believed to be alive in Gaza have been calling for medications to be passed on to their loved ones. So seems like some sort of deal here, at least that there's this behind the scenes negotiating happening. We'll see if this develops into, we'll see if this actually happens. Sometimes it's just hard to say what's going to happen with these agreements. All right, so the next one here, the people of Gaza are being starved to death. So this article, this is from Daniel Larison, his Substack. And if you're not familiar with Larison, he's a great writer. He's a contributor to antiwar.com. He was previously a senior writer for the American Conservative, very good foreign policy analyst, very serious, and this is just kind of a blog post he has about this famine that is unfolding in Gaza. And he quotes Alex DeWall, who wrote a book on modern famines. And this is a quote from him that Larison starts us off with. It says, "If the catastrophe in Gaza continues on its current trajectory, the prediction of mass death from disease, hunger, and exposure will come to pass. If humanitarian assistance is provided promptly and at scale, deaths from hunger and disease will stabilize and decline, but they will still take time to return to pre-crisis levels. Even with an immediate cessation of hostilities and the delivery of emergency aid, along with efforts to restore water, sanitation, and health services, mortality would remain elevated for weeks or months. Even this would constitute a major famine according to the definition of 10,000 or more deaths. A great famine with 100,000 or more excess deaths may be in prospect if the current level of hostilities and destruction continues." So this is Larison writing now. He says, "As I wrote in my column last week, this is one of the worst man-made famines in recent history. The people of Gaza are being deliberately starved by Israel's siege as part of a policy of collective punishment. We are watching an atrocity famine unfold in front of us. Our government isn't just failing to do anything about it, but is also actively helping the perpetrator wage its war and is providing diplomatic cover for the crime. The reality of mass starvation in Gaza is already here, and if nothing else changes, it will only get much worse over time." The UN's Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, had this to say recently. He said, quote, "The great majority of 400,000 Gazans characterized by UN agencies as at risk of starving are actually in famine, not just at risk of famine," end quote. And he said that recently on CNN. So Larison says there must be a ceasefire, but a ceasefire alone won't be enough to halt the humanitarian catastrophe. It involves not only severe hunger, but the rapid spread of disease. And he's basically saying, and this is true, even if a ceasefire happens and they stop, Gaza's destroyed. People's homes are destroyed. They're not going to have anywhere to go back to. Many of them are still going to have to live out in tents on the street. And there's infrastructure is destroyed. Again, the mortality will still be high, even if they stopped it right now. So if they keep this thing going, which the Israelis keep saying that they're going to do, they're going to continue this for a whole year, a lot of people, hundreds of thousands could die of starvation or disease this year. Really, really horrific stuff that is, again, being completely enabled and supported by our government. All right, so the next one here, this was kind of the big story of the day. The U.S. launches more strikes on the Houthis in Yemen. So that's right, the U.S. bombed Yemen yet again. So the U.S. military said on Tuesday that it launched more strikes against the Houthis in Yemen as tensions in the region continue to escalate. U.S. Central Command claimed that it hit Houthi anti-ship missiles. CENTCOM said, quote, "At approximately 4:15 a.m. Sana'a time, U.S. forces struck and destroyed 4 Houthi anti-ship ballistic missiles prepared to launch from Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen," end quote. But later in the day, the Houthis were able to target a Greek-owned ship in the Red Sea, despite the U.S. strikes. So it just goes to show how, the U.S. is not going to be able to prevent the Houthis from hitting ships in the Red Sea and in the Gulf of Aden. CENTCOM said that this vessel, the Zographia, reported that they were struck, but they continued their transit and no injuries were reported, so they were able to move on. So the Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, took credit for the attack and said that the Zografi was bound for Israel. Houthi military spokesman Yahya Sarria said Yemeni forces, quote, targeted the ship Zografia, which was headed to the ports of occupied Palestine with several adequate missiles, leaving direct hits, end quote. So the Houthis have made clear they will not stop attacks on Israeli-linked commercial shipping until the U.S.-backed slaughter in Gaza ends. But the U.S. is not pressuring Israel to end it. Instead, they're escalating, and this is the third round of U.S. airstrikes, or whether they launch them from warships or fighter jets isn't clear. But this is the third time the U.S. bombed Yemen since Friday, when the U.S. and the U.K. hit a bunch of targets across Yemen. So things just keep spiraling, and it's just really unbelievable because, they're not going to stop the Houthis. I mean, even if they launch a full war again against them, they're not going to be able to stop them. And now, because the U.S. bombed the Houthis, they're starting to target American shipping. They hit an American commercial vessel the other day. And more shipping companies are suspending transits through the Red Sea. So the whole purpose of this was to protect shipping, and now shipping's disrupted even more. Shell, the British oil company, announced that it is suspending its transits through the Red Sea, and they're a huge oil company. So U.S. officials have acknowledged that the strikes on Yemen did not hamper the Houthis' offensive capabilities, and there's some details here, but we have a few stories on the situation in Yemen to get into. The next one here is kind of a strange story that we haven't heard too much about. 2 Navy SEALs are missing after the U.S. seized a weapon shipment in the Gulf of Aden. So this story I saw first was reported like last Friday with very few details. It was kind of vague. It seemed a little sketchy to me, but now we have the U.S. military saying that 2 U.S. Navy SEALs have gone missing in the Gulf of Aden off the coast of Somalia during a mission to seize an alleged Iranian weapon shipment bound for the Houthis in Yemen. So one of these Navy SEALs fell into the water while attempting to board the small boat known as a dhow, which is just a name for you see the picture here of these small boats that operate in the area, these little cargo boats. And then, so one SEAL fell in, and then a second SEAL jumped in to try to rescue him, and they have both been missing since. The U.S. military says that they're continuing search and rescue operations in the Gulf of Aden. And this incident occurred around the time that the U.S. and Britain launched airstrikes across Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen, which significantly escalated the situation in the region. Because when I first saw this, it seemed like it happened right around the same time the U.S. and the U.K. bombed Yemen, so I thought maybe it was actually the Houthis did hit an American ship or something, but no, it turns out they were boarding this little boat, and they're claiming that they found Iranian missile components that were headed to the Houthis. There was 14 crew members on board. They actually sank the boat, and they arrested the 14 crew members, and it says they're determining what they're going to do with them based on so-called international law. It's just amazing how the U.S. can just do whatever it wants there, seize boats, and nobody sees the hypocrisy in that. And, they can arm Israel, but Iran can't arm the Houthis. But anyway, Iran supports the Houthis politically, but they've always denied that they arm them. CENTCOM said that this was the first seizure of advanced Iranian ballistic missile and cruise missile components by the U.S. Navy since November 2019. So it seemed, they don't often find missile components. And then if you look at the pictures that CENTCOM put out, I mean, they don't look very impressive, these components that they found. Pretty small. There's not really that many of them. And then there's they have pictures of just, I don't know what, just like bags of things, and then the boat that they sank. So it doesn't seem like it's that impressive of a find here. But this is 2 U.S. Navy SEALs who are probably dead at this point. So 2 American service members are dead. in this mess so far. There was also that helicopter crash, if you remember. I believe it was in October when the U.S. first started sending aircraft carriers and all that to the region. There was a helicopter crash off Cyprus in the Eastern Mediterranean, and I believe 5 American Special Operations Forces soldiers died in that crash. All right, so the next one here. U.S. and British airstrikes force aid groups to suspend operations in Yemen. So U.S. and British airstrikes in Yemen have forced some aid groups to suspend operations in the country, and they are warning against further escalation in the region. Before Israel unleashed its campaign in Gaza, the UN said that Yemen was the world's worst humanitarian crisis. It was a conflict that many people were just unaware of, especially in the U.S., even though this was a horrific war backed and supported by the United States government. And this war, which was a Saudi UAE-led coalition, involved brutal tactics, bombing civilian infrastructure, including food supply, including fishing boats, including sheep. They would bomb, farms, and really, really horrific. I actually linked to a story from The Guardian from 2017 when it was really when things were really bad there. And it's titled "Bombed into Famine: How Saudi Air Campaign Targets Yemen's Food Supplies." And there's a ton of details in there about the tactics, just the targeting of things like fishing boats. And there's something about them bombing farms, like bombing livestock, always stuck with me. So the U.S.-backed coalition also enforced a blockade on Houthi-controlled Yemen, which is where 70 to 80% of Yemenis live. And the number that the UN has put out that they estimate were killed in this war is 377,000, and more than half, about 60%, died due to starvation and disease caused by the siege. And most of those people who died were children under the age of 5. The most vulnerable always die when it comes to things like this. And I know Scott Horton always talks to Nasser Arabi. He's a Yemeni journalist based in Sana'a. And he's always said that the number must be much higher. So Yemenis have had some relief since April 2022 when the Saudis and the Houthis reached a tentative ceasefire. The truce has held relatively well and the blockade has been eased, but the majority of Yemenis are still reliant on aid. So 26 aid groups said in a statement, quote, "Nearly 9 years of war have left more than 21 million people, over 2/3 of the population, in desperate need of food, water, and life-saving assistance. Millions of Yemenis face widespread displacement, food insecurity, and limited access to basic services," end quote. The statement said that after the U.S. and British airstrikes, quote, "some humanitarian organizations have been forced to suspend operations over safety and security concerns while others assess their ability to operate," end quote. And I mentioned that the U.S. launched a third round of airstrikes in Yemen on Tuesday. The U.S. is actually preparing to take another step that could impede aid deliveries to Yemen. So I've talked about this before. There was reports on Tuesday saying that the Biden administration is ready to redesignate the Houthis as specially designated global terrorists. And so the wording is confusing because, so I hope this isn't too confusing, but so at the end of the Trump administration, they labeled the Houthis, Mike Pompeo, his Secretary of State, labeled the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. And that comes with automatic sanctions. Basically means anybody who does business with the Houthis, which are the government in the area of Yemen where most people live, where the most desperate aid-reliant people are, those sanctions mean that anybody who does business with them can be targeted. Basically criminalizes delivering aid into Houthi-controlled areas. So Biden came in and reversed it because aid groups in the UN were saying this is going to kill people. People are going to starve to death because of this. And now they're thinking about redesignating the Houthis as this foreign terrorist organization. But the wording on Tuesday was this specially designated global terrorists, which is kind of different. And that might just apply to Houthi leadership. But then I saw, so that might be more limited than the foreign terrorist organization. But then I saw other reports that said it was going to be the FTO. But they said they might announce it on Wednesday. So we'll find out on Wednesday. But essentially what they're going to do here is doom more people into starvation. You know, they're starving people in Gaza. Now they're going to start starving people in Yemen again. And It's just really horrific. I just can't believe we're here in this place, and the Saudis are the ones urging restraint. And another thing about this designation, that there's a Saudi Houthi peace deal that will be impossible to implement if the Houthis are labeled as a foreign terrorist organization, because the first phase involves depositing money that I believe is money from oil and gas sales that's supposed to pay Yemeni civil workers, government workers in Houthi-controlled areas. So money needs to be deposited into accounts in Houthi-controlled Yemen. That will be, sanctionable activity if this designation happens. And then the other thing is just lifting the blockade, fully lifting the blockade, allowing more airliners to come in and out of the Sana'a airport and more ships to go into Hodeidah, the Red Sea port. Again, that'll be sanctionable activity if they go ahead with this. So it'll kill the peace deal, and that's what the U.S. has been threatening to do. So just again, it's just really horrific, the direction that we're going here in Yemen. When they had some relief, it seemed like things were pretty good, getting much better for the people on the ground, but not anymore. The next one here, North Korea labels South Korea as a principal enemy. So North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has said his country will abandon its decades-old policy of seeking reconciliation with South Korea as tensions continue to soar on the Korean peninsula. So in a speech on Monday, Kim called for Pyongyang to change its constitution to label Seoul as an invariable principal enemy. And if war breaks out, Kim said that North Korea's goals should be to take over South Korean territory. So he said, quote, "In my opinion, we can specify in our constitution the issue of completely occupying, subjugating, and reclaiming the Republic of Korea and annex it as part of the territory of our republic in case of a war breaking out on the Korean peninsula," end quote. Kim said that a statue erected in Pyongyang in 2001 to commemorate former North Korean leader Kim Il-sung's reunification proposals should be removed. It was basically a statue to hope for reunification, reconciliation between the North and the South. And he wants that torn down. He said, quote, "We should also completely remove the eyesore monument to the three charters for national reunification standing at the southern gateway at the capital city of Pyongyang and take other measures so as to completely eliminate such concepts as reunification, reconciliation, and fellow countrymen from the national history of our republic," end quote. So the North Korean leader blamed the tensions on the U.S. and joint military drills it has held with South Korea. The U.S. and South Korea resumed major war games in 2022 after South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol came into office. So Yoon came in 2022 and vowed to take a much harder line against the North than his predecessor Moon Jae-in, who pursued Korean unification. And a lot of progress was made during the Trump administration. The North and the South were really talking. Trump met with Kim. It was sabotaged by the neocons that Trump hired in his administration, famously by really John Bolton. And but tensions still were eased, and there weren't these big war games until Yoon came in and restarted them. And these drills are extremely provocative toward the North, as they have included the rehearsing of the assassination of Kim. The U.S. has also deployed bombers and other strategic assets to the region, including docking a nuclear-armed submarine in South Korea for the first time since the 1980s, which was just insane. An insane thing to do is to dock, Biden brought nukes to the Korean peninsula. That's what he did. And, these nuclear-armed submarines they can be sailing anywhere, underwater, anywhere in the world. They have very long-range missiles. If they wanted to hit somebody with them, they could be very far. There's no need to dock them and show them off, other than if you just want to say you just want a provocation just for the sake of it. And North Korea typically responds to the provocations by firing missiles or other types of weapons, and the two sides are stuck in this cycle of tit-for-tat escalation. Biden showed no interest in de-escalating things here, and that's because the U.S. views these deployments. They could send bombers and hold these big drills because it's right near China. It's part of their kind of muscle flexing and military buildup that's actually aimed at China. So Kim said that, quote, instability of the regional situation is soaring due to the U.S.-led escalation of military tensions, end quote. He said the things are reaching a red line. So this isn't good. I mean, the fact that he's, and then the North Korea's Supreme People's Assembly has followed Kim's speech by abolishing the government organizations responsible for communication with the South and working toward reconciliation. So this is not a good sign. This is an area that I've neglected, that most people are not aware of how high the tensions are right now on the Korean Peninsula. And this is one of those situations, it's kind of similar to Gaza in a way, that it's like a sort of an untenable situation, this divide between North and South Korea, and the militarized border, and the war games and the tensions and the nuclear and just all the stuff that happens. It's kind of background noise because it's been this way for so long, but this could explode into something. It's the same thing, you have Gaza under blockade for almost 20 years, or how long now, maybe 16, 17 years, and, it was, something happened, something really bad happened. So there's always a chance with this, and this is just one of the many areas around the world where the U.S. is heavily and deeply involved, and things could really break out at any time. All right, so the next one here, Ukrainian troops are on active defense. So the commander of Ukraine's ground forces has said that his troops are on active defense as Ukrainian forces are no longer attempting to gain territory after the failed counteroffensive. So this is General Alexander Surtsky. He said, quote, "Our goals remain unchanged, holding our positions, exhausting the enemy by inflicting maximum losses," end quote. So that's what their goal is. They're not even saying that they're trying to take any territory now. Just about defense, and there's still fighting going on along the front, and it is, just a, kind of a stalemate at this point. And time is on Russia's side as we see the Western aid drying up and Ukraine suffering these manpower issues, and they're not able to replenish their forces, and they're struggling to pass this new mobilization bill. So it's just not a good situation for the Ukrainians when it comes to this war. But despite that, Ukrainian political leadership, they're still saying they're going to win. They're still saying they're going to kick the Russians out. The defense minister, Rustem Umerov, said on Sunday that Kiev has not given up on its goal to restore the 1991 borders. And that means kicking Russia out of all of the territory that it captured since February 2022, and also kicking them out of Crimea, which Russia has controlled and governed since 2014, which is just completely unrealistic. But that's still what the political leadership is saying. They seem determined to keep this war going. And when you talk about Zelensky's political survival, if he has to negotiate a deal where he hands over all this territory to Russia, his political career is going to be over after that. All right, so the next one here, Congress forms a caucus to aid an Iranian ex-terror group. So this article is from Matthew Petty at Responsible Statecraft. So several members of Congress have created a caucus to support the Mojahedin-e-Khalq, which is the MEK. They're an exiled Iranian faction that once fought for Saddam Hussein and was formally listed as a terror organization by the U.S. government. They're really a cult. It's a very strange group. They're based at this compound in Albania, and they have these conferences every year called like the Free Iran conferences, and former U.S. officials always speak at them and get nice big chunks of money. And now they're forming a caucus in Congress to support them, which is insane. And the current caucus chairman is Lance Gooden, a Republican from Texas, and the other members who have signed on so far are Paul Gosar. He's a Republican from Arizona. He's good on some things. I'm surprised to see him signing on to this. Nicole Malliotakis, a Republican from New York, and Hispanic Caucus Chairman Paul Ruiz, Democrat from California. So they're saying that this organization of Iranian American communities, a pro-MEK group, was lobbying Democratic offices to join the caucus. And the MEK, they were involved in Israeli attacks inside Iran, assassinations. They took the side, basically, of Iraq during the 1980s Iran-Iraq war. They've been responsible for terrorist attacks. So they have no popularity inside Iran because of those things. But yet for many people in the U.S., many U.S. officials or former U.S. officials, they're kind of considered an option. If there's regime change in Iran, we can install the MEK, which would really be something else. So they're picking up more support in Congress amid all the tensions that are happening here. But that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Jeffrey Sachs, Why Joe Biden is a Foreign Policy Failure. One from Ted Snyder, U.S. strikes on Yemen are layered in hypocrisy. One from Alpha Al-Kurd, I like my grandmother 75 years ago. I now live in a tent in the Gaza Strip. Somebody's account from the ground in Gaza. One from Karen Greenberg, sunsetting the war on terror or not. And one from Trita Parsi, how Biden can stop Houthi missile attacks without risking war. So go check all of that out. You could always support us by sharing this show, telling your friends about antiwar.com. Like and subscribe on YouTube. I appreciate all the comments. Been getting a lot lately. And if you listen to the podcast audio version, please leave a rating or a review on whatever app you use to listen to it if you can. That stuff really helps. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.